So with more and more people out on the water today, we're constantly having to use different techniques to cover water and a finesse technique to try to trick these fish that have seen pretty much every bait in the books. And unless you live in Florida or Texas, one bait that seems to have been forgotten is a Carolina rig. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I like catching big fish and I like covering water as fast as I can to find those big fish. And with having to use more and more finesse techniques when I'm around other anglers, a Carolina rig is a phenomenal way to do that. With that big ball and weight on there, you can huck that sucker around, but the leader length and the natural fall rate of that bait with no weight attached to the bait gives it a presentation that these fish do not see very often because people just don't throw it. So it allows me to cover a ton of water, catch some big fish, and what I want to do today is break down a Carolina rig on the exact weights, rods, reels, hooks, line, how I fish it, everything about it today. So let's dive right into it. So right off the bat, why do I think you should be throwing a Carolina rig? Well, for the fact right now fish are becoming post-spawn. No matter where you live across the country, fish are spawning or they are far past post-spawn. So your fish are starting to get offshore a little bit, and that's when a Carolina rig shines extremely, extremely well because you can change the weight size to fish 5 feet of water or you can fish 50 feet of water realistically and everywhere in between. And the beauty of it is you can cover water. It works really, really well in grass, which is something people don't think about. That's right, even you northern guys that are fishing for smallmouth, a Carolina rig is phenomenal. People up on Champlain have been using this rig for years because they know how effective it is at catching smallmouth in grass, and nobody else really thinks about it. With a weedless Texas rig bait on there, you can come through cover extremely, extremely well. So now let's get out on the water. I'm going to show you how to fish a Carolina rig so you can really see what you need to be doing when you're actually fishing it and how to actually land some of these fish with a Carolina rig. Alright guys, so it's a little bit windy out here, but what we have here is we have a shell bed on a point that's set up, and right now the water temp is like 68. So those fish are just in that post spawn, some are still spawning. And so what this is a long point that tapers off of the bank, has that nice hard bottom on it, right off of some grass that those fish are really gonna gravitate toward. I really expect there's gonna be a lot of smallmouth on it just because that water's still cool. So those smallmouth are gonna be shallow. I'm gonna be throwing that Carolina rig up there and just dragging it across that shell bar and feeling that shell bar with that Carolina rig, using my electronics to make sure I'm throwing right up on it. We have the wind coming up across it too. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna set on the downwind side of it and throw up onto it and drag it across. Hopefully the audio isn't too bad with this wind, but that's what we're gonna do, so we're gonna get after it. So as you can see, as I'm working this bait back in, I'm constantly popping the rod and sliding it across the bottom, using that weight to feel for any rock or any shell or anything hard on the bottom, whether it be a log sitting there, and that way I can pause it if I feel that. You'll also notice that I try to get a reaction strike just like I would with a football jig, like I've talked about so much, by popping it off of that rock, and that's really what seals the deal because you get those violent hops, but that bait also glides back, so you get that reaction of that bait hopping up and then gliding back down, and then those fish just have a longer chance to come up in there and look at it, and it has that natural fall like a Senko would where it glides down, and that's when those fish come up and pick it up because there's just so much more subtle movement there than you would find with a typical football jig or anything else, and that's why these baits shine around pressure. Just like that, speed craw right in the face. See that hook's got some nice penetration there. Not a big smallie, but not a bad one. There we go, nice smallmouth on that Carolina rig just up here on that shell bar. You can see he ate it really good. You can still see the hook point where it went through right there. But we're just dragging that sucker along, and you're hopping it through those rocks because that Carolina rig feels just like dragging a football jig would, and you treat it just the same way. When you get it hung up, you just pop it free, and that bait's gonna do the same thing, but instead of falling right back down, it glides right back down, and those fish can come up and grab right a hold of it. Real quick, those of you guys that are new to the channel, don't be afraid to hit that subscribe button, but let's keep talking about Carolina rigs. So let's talk about some of the gear that I'm going to throw a Carolina rig on, because you know why it's such a good bait. You can cover deep water, you can cover shell beds, you can feel the bottom, which is something that people also don't think about. I can tell hard spots on the bottom. So those of you guys that don't have very good graphs, what you can do is you can put a heavy Carolina rig on and feel your way across the bottom. It's one of my absolute favorite river baits for smallmouth and just fishing in current in general because that big weight rolls along the bottom better. And with bigger line, I can pull it out of cover so much easier, you know, if it gets wedged in rocks. But what kind of gear am I going to be throwing a Carolina rig with? So there's a couple different hooks, and there's something that I really want to talk about is I use a traditional offset worm hook, because if you use an EWG hook, your bait will spin, which is, I personally witnessed it. My buddy called me and was like, you need to try this. And I was like, okay, so I tried it. He was completely right. I don't know why. You would think a bigger hook with that EWG would help keel that bait, but it doesn't. It makes it spin, which blows my mind out of the water. So I like this Trocar HD worm hook, so that way that bait doesn't spin, that has a bigger barb on it. I can really penetrate those fish's roof of their mouth easily, put every single one of them in the boat. I like it in a 3/0 to a 5/0, but I'll have everything linked down below like I always do. And then a lot of times I'm going to be running my main line at 15 to 20 pound P-line tactical fluorocarbon, and then my leader, as far as, you know, what's going to be attached to my hook for my swivel to my hook, is going to be in that 12 to 15 pound range. I really don't go below 12 just because for the aspect of it, it kind of hinders it. I don't like having any of that lighter line on there, because if I'm using a bigger rod, I don't want to break those fish off if it's a bigger fish on the hook set. So Strike King actually has come out with these cool little weight packets, which are pre-made Carolina rigs. I like throwing a brass weight pretty much exclusively. I don't like throwing tungsten, but I suppose you could if you were trying to feel out the bottom a little bit more to get a little better idea of what's down there. If you're fishing the Great Lakes or somewhere where there's smallmouth, or you're really looking for hard bottom, maybe Florida, tungsten might be a great option for you, especially if you're not afraid to lose weights, or if you're really not concerned about losing weights. Florida might be a great place to do it because of the shell beds and stuff that are so important down there. But that would be the only reason I would use a tungsten weight. Most of the time I use a brass weight, and they come in a quarter all the way up to an ounce. So that kind of covers you for your entire spectrum as far as what weights you're going to be needing. I like a 1/4 ounce when I'm fishing like 10 feet or less. And then as soon as I start getting over 10 feet, I'm going to go to that half. Then if I get over 15 feet, I'm going to go to 3/4 and then 1 ounce, and just kind of feel it out. You just want to maintain bottom contact. And one thing that's a big topic that people always kind of nitpick around is the leader length. Now, you're going to get more reaction out of a shorter leader, and you're going to get less reaction out of a longer leader. And what I mean by that is the longer the leader, the more natural your bait's going to look. It's not going to be as affected by your movements of your rod. A shorter leader is going to make that bait more reactive. So a lot of times I like to go to a longer leader in the summertime, because those fish have seen a lot more pressure, and that leader, that bait is just going to glide more and have more of a fall rate. Same thing around grass. I like using a longer leader so that way it stays above the grass and doesn't get pulled down into it if we hit a thicker patch. Now in the springtime, when that grass is short, fish are fresh, I'm really trying to cover water fast, I will go to a shorter leader, but I typically run like a 3 to 5 foot leader, which seems pretty long, but it does a great job at keeping that bait elevated and giving that bait a natural glide and a natural fall rate, and giving those fish time to really feel that they, you know, it's not like a typical bait when they eat it, you're directly connected to them. They can eat it and kind of have a second. But that also makes it tricky because you don't want to tongue hook fish or let the fish swallow the bait, which is something we really never have to think about. With fishing a Carolina rig, you kind of have to think about it. Now let's talk about a few baits that I like to throw, because there's really, I think I throw 3 baits on a Carolina rig. Just 3. I'm either going to throw a Zoom Speed Craw, a Zoom Brush Hog, or I'm going to throw a swim bait, whether it's a Kitech or a Z-Man Diesel Minnow. Now you guys know how much I love Z-Man plastics, but I don't like that they float behind a Carolina rig. I've ran with them a little bit, and they don't sink right. And I like baits to sink. I like that fall rate. I like them to get down in the bottom, and so that's why I use the Zoom product line. And it just does a great job at getting those bigger bites. You know, I throw that baby brush hog when I'm around smaller fish. When I need a bigger bite, I will go to the full-size brush hog. You can also throw a worm. If you're around a lot of pressured areas where there's a lot of boats, you can throw just a traditional trick worm on the back of it. That does a great job when you're fishing down in Florida, when you're fishing around fish that get beat in all day long. That's also a phenomenal option. And, you know, if it's flat, calm, and sunny out, and there's no current, no matter where you're at, that trick worm or just a straight tail worm might be a great option for you. But when I'm up smallmouth fishing, that's when I really like to throw the swim bait on the back of a Carolina rig. Does a phenomenal job at just imitating a small goby, a small bait fish going through that grass, and it really gets some big bites. And as far as smallmouth go, it is a great way to catch big smallmouth. So where do I like to fish a Carolina rig? I like to fish a Carolina rig if I'm up north and I'm fishing a hard spot with grass on it. I like to fish it anywhere that I'm fishing deeper water that I need to cover water. So if I know these fish have been pressured, like Tennessee River, that kind of stuff, if I'm fishing offshore brush piles, if I'm fishing anything where I am trying to run water as fast as I physically can in an area that has pressure. So, or if it's an area that is a little bit bigger, like a big gravel bar, then I'm like, I need to cover this water fast. Because if I sit here and throw a Ned rig all day, I'm going to burn an hour and a half. Versus a Carolina rig, I can hook it out and just drag it back across there. Same thing I would really like to do with the swing head. Does the same job, but different presentation style. But I can cover water faster and in an efficient manner. Or another reason I like to throw a Carolina rig is if I'm covering water and I know there's big fish in the area. If I'm like, okay, I know there's some absolute giant fish in here, I'm going to put some of these bigger baits on here, cover water faster, and just really see if I can't get a bigger bite. Because I can throw these bigger size soft plastics on there in a way that they've never really seen them, because it's going to be a weightless presentation. But that Carolina rig really shines around grass for me. Anytime I'm really trying to put a finesse presentation in those fish's face and I know there's a lot of grass on the bottom, it's a great way to get bit. I kind of pair that with a drop shot, keeping it above that grass, but this is a way I can just make sure I get bigger bites. So let's talk about the rod, the reel, and the line that I'm going to throw on this. I tend to stick with a 7/6 Arc Essence. It's a medium heavy fast action, so it has more of a parabolic bend to it, but it's a little bit longer rod that allows me to really throw that bait, but not so long that I overwork myself trying to throw a Carolina rig all day. I don't want it to absolutely break my shoulders when I'm trying to fish it, but I also want that leverage to be able to pick up a lot of line to be able to hook those fish. Now, if you're really trying to cover water or you're fishing for really big fish and you're throwing heavier line, you could go to a 7/11 heavy. You know, if you're fishing down in Texas or something like that where you're like around giant fish all day, I suppose you could do that, but I like that 7/6. As far as the gear ratio reel, I'm going to go to an 8:1:1 Arc G5, and the reason I like that 8:1:1 is I pick up line faster. And so a lot of times when those fish eat that bait, if your weight is here, sometimes they'll eat it, kind of move forward. And so all I'm going to do when I feel a fish eat it is I'm going to reel till I start to feel that fish, then I'm going to lean on them. Because what that's going to do is that sweeping hook set is really going to penetrate deeply into that fish's mouth. Make sure I have a good hookup ratio. But that 8:5 or 8:1:1 just allows me to really keep that line tight and keep that fish coming to the boat, and which is what we all want. And so that's how you really maintain that contact. And then, like I said, the main line that I'm going to throw is that pretty much 20-pound P-line tactical fluorocarbon. You know, when you start to get down to thinner line, you get more stretch, and sometimes if you're on a long cast, it's harder to really get that hook penetration. So another finesse technique that I really like to throw when I'm fishing around pressured fish, but I'm a little bit shallower, is a Senko. And I'm going to have a link up here to my Senko tips, and I break down 5 different Senkos, and I even have underwater footage of how they sink and the different sink rates of it, and which ones I think you should be throwing and which ones I think you should not be throwing. So thank you guys so much for watching. God bless, and I hope y'all take care.